everybody, it's Dana. Welcome back. Today I am still playing with this gorgeous stencil from Altenew. I just can't get enough of this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and show you another way that I'm using this beautiful stencil. Alright, so as you can see, I went ahead and I put a little bit of adhesive on the back of my watercolor paper. And I'm just going to lay down my stencil. This time I'm not going to tape it down in place. I'm just going to actually hold it down with my hand. I'm going to grab my Versamark and I'm going to line up my stencil. And I'm going to use my hand and I'm just going to hold it in place. And I'm just going to tap on or actually smush on some Versamark. So for you guys who don't know, Versamark is a clear ink. And you can actually just leave it on your paper and heat set it and it just leaves like a watermark, or you can put embossing powder on top of it and heat set it and get color. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to heat emboss it with some white embossing powder so we can get a design on it that we can do something fun with a little bit later. So as you can see, I'm just continuously pressing that Versamark into my card panel right through that stencil. So I'm just going to now lift up the stencil, and now you can kind of see that I have like a little watermark on the paper. Now I'm going to bring in some white embossing powder. Now when I start putting on this embossing powder, you're really going to be able to see that design. So you can see it right there in white because I'm just putting on white embossing powder. Now I could do this with clear if I just wanted to have just a clear design on the back, but I wanted to do this in white so it kind of stands out a little bit better. So I'm just going to make sure that I get some of that embossing powder all over my card panel. I'm just tilting it to the light so I can make sure that I have it all covered, and I'm going to tap off some of the excess. Now I did not use an embossing buddy on this to take off any of the static first, and I'm okay with that. I'm just going to grab a paintbrush and kind of flick off some of the areas where I did get some embossing powder that I just want to make sure I remove. But in this technique, I don't necessarily have to be perfect with this. So I'm going to go ahead and get that embossing powder out of the way. And I'm just going to get a few more spots where I still had some embossing powder. Alright, so I'm going to grab my heat gun. And I'd like to make sure that my heat gun is hot before I bring it to my embossing powder to melt. This just helps to speed up the process of that embossing powder melting. So I'm going to go ahead and start on the bottom, and then I'm going to lift up my card panel so you can actually see the embossing powder melt. So as you can see, I'm going to start at the top, and you can actually see that white embossing powder melting into the paper. So that's what your embossing powder should look like when it begins to melt. And that's when you can actually tell that it's melted into your paper. So it actually melts and becomes shiny on your paper. And that's when you know it is all melted and complete. So I'm just going to drop that down so I don't burn my hand. And it's actually a really cool and fun thing to watch. I'm just going to make sure that is all done. I'm going to lift that up and kind of tilt it just to make sure. And you can see now it's really shiny. So that means that it's all nice and dry. Alright, I'm just going to go ahead and tap on it, make sure it's dry and it's not sticky anymore. And now we can go on to the next step of this. Alright, to add some color, I'm going to actually use some color bursts. So I'm going to use a purple. So I'm going to use orchid and fuchsia because I want to do two different colors. So I'm going to go ahead and first spritz that down with some water. And this is going to immediately start activating my color burst. So color burst is a dried pigment. And it activates with water. So I'm going to just tap some of that onto my card panel. And this stuff is like magic. Oh my God, I love this. This Embrusso is one of my favorite dry mediums to use on a card. So as you can see, that it's already activating on my card. I'm going to spritz it a little bit more and then you're really going to see it. Now I'm going to go back in areas where I want a little bit more color, and I'm just going to gently tap in some of that extra color. So I'm adding a little bit more of the purple, and I'm going to go back in. I'm going to add a little bit more of the fuchsia. I really want to have strong concentrated color on this. So again, I'm going to spritz it with some water. And look how beautiful that looks. So it's really saturated. And I'm just going to let it hang out there for a second. And then I'm going to heat it with my heat gun. And this is really going to get all that pretty color to start soaking into that watercolor paper. Now, some people like to go ahead and start removing some of the color. I'm just going to let it sit there and actually soak into the paper and actually get into that embossing as well. That looks gorgeous. All right, now I'm going to take a paper towel and I'm going to blot up some of that excess. Just going to rub it over, and you'll see that some of it also comes off on the paper towel. So that's a really quick and easy way to color your background without having to go through the problem of like watercoloring everything. You just grab yourself some color bursts and you're good. So I'm going to go ahead again and grab my heat gun, and I'm going to take out a little bit more of the moisture out of this paper. I'm just going to make sure I heat it from both sides. I always like to do this just so I can kind of get most of the moisture out, but it also keeps the paper from being warped on both sides. So now since that's done, I'm going to now go and rub in whatever color is left over. And I'm just going to rub that into the card. So you'll see whatever color burst was left over on the card panel, I'm just going to buff it right in. So I'm also going to be able to spread some of that color around. Isn't that beautiful? I just love this. So I have all that beautiful color all over that, and it just really makes that design just really pop. It looks fantastic. All right, so now let's go ahead and get this onto our card panel. So what I'm going to do is use my trimmer, and I'm not going to use the whole panel in a way I normally would just by putting it on a card. I'm actually going to take it and split this card panel in half. So I'm going to line up my medallion image, and I'm going to cut right through the center of it. And I'm going to kind of use this in a different way than I normally would. So I'm going to grab a piece of typing paper because I know that my mat still has some color on it and I don't want to mess up this card. So as you can see, I now have two pieces, but I'm going to be able now to put like a sentiment right between the middle of my card. By splitting those two, it gave me a little bit of an area to put in a sentiment. So this stamp set here is from Altenew, and it's a new one, and I've only probably used one of these stamps in here. I think I've only used one of these stamps in here before. So I'm going to use the Happy Birthday one, and I'm going to grab in my Mini Misty, and this is going to allow me to make sure I get this lined up the first time. I think I have something on my card, so I'm just going to clean that off. And then for my ink today, I'm going to use some of the Versa Fine Black Onyx ink. This is like my favorite ink. I love it for any of my sentiments, any detail work. It is like my go-to ink. So I'm going to go ahead and press that down. Now, since this is a brand new sentiment I'm using, I'm going to double stamp this just because I didn't have time to condition this stamp. I'm just going to make sure I double stamp this so I can get a good impression. Go ahead and press that down. All right, looking fabulous. I'm going to go ahead and get that out of the way. We can move our Mini Misty out of the way, and we are good. Now we can go ahead and start putting our card together. Now, because this paper is so warped, I'm going to use some score tape to put this together. And that's just because the paper was really saturated, so it had a tendency to warp. So instead of just using regular adhesive, I'm going to go ahead and use some score tape just to make sure that it really has a good bond to my card base. So right here, all I'm doing is marking the area in which I need to cut off. So my panel obviously is not hanging off of my card. So I'm going to bring back in my trimmer, and I need to just trim off that little bit of extra. And I'm actually taking it from the outside. So I'm not taking it from the inside where I cut my flower in half. Just remember, if you do this technique, you have to take from the outside of your card. So you're not actually cutting into your flower piece. All right, so I can go ahead and trim that part off. And we are almost done with this card. All right, so I'm going to bring back in the card. And now I'm going to go ahead and use score tape. So really the reason I'm going to use the score tape again is because the paper had gotten really worked and saturated with water from all of the spritzing. So just to make sure that this stays onto my card and I get really good bond is really the reason I'm going to be using the score tape instead of using my ATG gun. So I'm just going to make sure that I put some of the score tape on all four corners. Now you can use the thinner score tape. This was the one that was close at hand, so I went ahead and grabbed the thicker width of it. And I'm kind of glad I did, because this is really going to make sure that this paper does not bow and lift off a little bit later. But after this card is done, I'm going to definitely make sure that I put something heavy on top of it. So the card would definitely at least stay flat when I send it out to the recipient. So I'm just going to pull off some of that release tape, or release backing from my tape rather. And then I'm going to go ahead and bend that paper, get it a little bit straighter before I put it down onto my card base. So I'm just going to line up my sides, and then I can press it down. Now that card would even look pretty just like that. Just by having that little bit of pop of color at the top. I could have left it just like that and it would have actually been a fantastic card. And I could have actually had two cards. I might think about that for next time. That'd be a really pretty clean and simple card just with that pop of color at the top. You might see that in another video. But I'm going to keep working on this one. So I'm going to go ahead and put the last of that tape down on this one here. See what happens when you make videos. You even surprise yourself. You're like, I could have did two cards out of that. So I'm just going to make sure that I have that score tape on there well. And then the tricky part sometimes with this score tape is just getting the release off the back of it. All right, so as you can see, this was a super easy technique to do. You can do this with so many colors of color burst, or if you don't have color burst, you can use brush out. All right, so again, I'm going to just make sure I line this up so that my two panels are facing. I'm going to bend that cardstock to get it a little bit more straight. And then I can go ahead and line that up and push that down. So look how pretty that is. But you know, I'm not done, right? You know, I gotta add a tiny few pieces of, you know, bling bling. So I'm going to grab my multi-matte medium here. And I'm gonna pop me down a couple sequins. Because, you know, I always have to bling it up. Just a tad bit. Not always, but you know, 99.9% of the time. So I'm using 2 pink and 1 purple, because you guys know I like to use odd numbers. And that is it. Okay, that now finishes off the card. All right, well, thank you guys for hanging out with me today. I hope you liked this little tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe and give me a thumbs up. I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.